I Am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Genre, sci-fi, action, adventure, fantasy. Chapter 401, Straightening Out the Thought Process. In the blink of an eye, 20 years passed, and the negotiations remained at a standstill. The members from the Troy civilization who attended the meetings had already been replaced multiple times. For some members of other civilizations, sleeping for decades or even centuries was perfectly normal. After all, time passed imperceptibly during cryosleep. However, Luo Wen struggled to adapt to this concept of time. For such a trivial matter to drag on this long? They had completely redefined the meaning of efficiency, and Luo Wen suddenly felt 80% of the pressure on his shoulders dissipate. With how things were proceeding, even if they were discussing whether to go to war with the swarm, it might take them centuries of arguing to reach a conclusion. Just as Luo Wen thought this endless stalling would continue, another event disrupted the rhythm. It came from the Riken. The third prince's actions, despite attempts at secrecy, had finally been exposed. His failed invitation could no longer be hidden. Since the swarm had yet to join the Interstellar Technological Confederation, there were no formal diplomatic exchanges or channels for information. Thus, Luo Wen learned of this incident only by overhearing idle chatter among Troy diplomats. Although the Daki civilization was relatively insignificant compared to Troy, the latter seemed to pay particular attention to them, perhaps due to a grudge. Luo Wen wasn't too worried about the strength of the Daki civilization. However, they had been part of the Confederation for millennia and had joined various internal organizations. Meanwhile, the swarm was still in the negotiation phase, technically not a member of the Confederation, and therefore not protected by its internal rules. Even within the Confederation, wars between civilizations were not uncommon, provided there was a plausible excuse. The key difference was that such conflicts were internal disputes, with the intensity of warfare kept within controlled limits. As an outsider, however, the swarm didn't enjoy these protections. Luo Wen worried that a conflict might escalate uncontrollably, with stronger allies joining the fray, turning a minor skirmish into a full-blown war. Coupled with the ongoing negotiations in the Genesis system, Luo Wen suspected this might be a coordinated good cop, bad cop strategy to pressure the swarm into accepting harsh terms. Fortunately, the situation didn't devolve into the worst-case scenario. Unable to contain themselves, the Daki civilization did amass their forces and launched a campaign to save face. Now, the Daki civilization had assembled a fleet of 50,000 warships, advancing menacingly toward the outer rim of the Riken system. These 50,000 warships represented nearly the entirety of Daki's available military strength. Their overwhelming momentum was apparent, but the swarm's presence in the Riken system was not what it had been 6 decades ago. The Daki had delayed far too long, and the swarm's deployments in the Riken system had grown vastly stronger. More than 1 million primordial bodies rose to meet them. Their sheer numbers were so immense that they blanketed the void of space like an overwhelming tide. And this was merely a fraction of the swarm's forces in the Riken system. In the end, after a brief probing skirmish, the Daki warships, despite comparable technology and a stark size disparity between individual units, were utterly outnumbered. With casualties amounting to half their fleet, they retreated in defeat, tails between their legs. Although the Daki civilization lost face once again, at least their fleet suffered minimal losses, preserving their core assets. This war, despite the swarm intentionally holding back, revealed certain truths that could no longer be concealed. Like the brightest star in the night sky, some things are impossible to hide. The swarm's unparalleled capacity for rapid military production became glaringly obvious to all. 60 years ago, a fleet of just over 2,000 Daki warships had inflicted heavy casualties on the swarm's forces in the Riken system. Yet now, the swarm had effortlessly repelled a 50,000 strong fleet. This disparity was noteworthy enough, but the true issue lay elsewhere. Despite mobilizing such a massive force, the primordial bodies basking in the stellar near orbit of the Riken system seemed untouched. This observation raised serious concerns. The primordial bodies of the swarm had always been there. Even though some were deliberately hidden, many remained visible. They were exposed to observation all along but appeared to have been consciously overlooked until this war, which had been decades in the making yet ended in an instant, jolted many to their senses. However, Luo Wen did not face stronger adversaries or coordinated attacks in the aftermath. Instead, changes began unfolding at A11 in the Genesis system. The pace of negotiations suddenly accelerated. Just 2 years after the war, several new G members arrived at the A11 swarm base aboard a warship styled like a treasure starship. These new G members replaced the original 5-member group, and Frode reappeared as well. The agreement reverted to the draft originally proposed by Buller, and their attitude was a stark contrast to their earlier stance. Their intentions to expedite negotiations were unmistakable, and the situation seemed to return to normalcy. "Overlord, what are you worried about?" Sarah appeared behind Luo Wen, her voice soft. "Have we calculated the speed of the G's ship?" Luo Wen ignored Sarah's question and directed his inquiry to Morgan. "It's done. Approximately 6 times the speed of light. Since they only had a single warship with a small profile, by the time we detected them, they were already close to our territory. It's unclear whether they decelerated earlier," Morgan replied. Luo Wen nodded. Fortunately, the technological gap wasn't insurmountable, though it would take time to catch up. And right now, time was what the swarm needed most. However, the current state of affairs felt even more surreal than before, leaving Luo Wen somewhat baffled. "Why do you think they want to speed up the negotiations?" Luo Wen murmured, seemingly to himself. Without waiting for Morgan or the other intelligent entities to respond, he continued, "It's definitely related to the Reincarnated Systems campaign. But what is their ultimate goal?" Luo Wen rewound the timeline and began piecing things together from the start. He couldn't discern who was orchestrating this game or how many factions were involved, but one thing was certain: the swarm was a pawn in their strategy. After the Daki civilization's third prince retreated in defeat, the Troy civilization immediately stepped in before Daki could launch a counterattack. What was the meaning of this? Luo Wen scratched his head, and then a sudden flash of insight struck him. That was it. The opposing factions likely had no idea that the swarm possessed both the swarm network and the ability to convert intelligent entities. Although the swarm had captured numerous Daki individuals, the other side couldn't be sure what those captives knew or what they might reveal. In essence, Buller's purpose was to educate the swarm about the Interstellar Technological Confederation. Though he himself was undoubtedly unaware of this role, his mission to discuss the swarm's membership inevitably involved disclosing critical information. What exactly had Buller said back then? Luo Wen began to recall and retrieved fragments of the scene from that time. Because Luo Wen had already learned about the Confederation and the G's origins beforehand, he hadn't paid much attention to the specifics of Buller's explanations. Looking back now, it was clear he had overlooked some details. Fortunately, Danton, who had been responsible for negotiations at the time, was unaware of this intelligence and inadvertently avoided potential pitfalls. Otherwise, Buller might have noticed inconsistencies and become suspicious. Pretending not to know something and genuinely not knowing it were entirely different, Luo Wen reflected. This time, luck had been on his side, but it wouldn't always be. He resolved to pay closer attention to the details moving forward. Chapter 402, Joining. Luo Wen carefully recalled the details. During negotiations, Buller had inadvertently disclosed a wealth of information, not only things Luo Wen was already aware of but also numerous bits of insider gossip, such as information about the Descendants faction. And then, almost immediately, the Descendants sent representatives? No wonder the timing and location of the 5-member G group's appearance seemed so peculiar, and their acquisition of negotiation authority so inexplicable. Was it because there wasn't enough time to set the stage properly? Luo Wen furrowed his brow in thought. No, he was still making some assumptions. The opposing side didn't know the swarm's methods, so theoretically, the swarm shouldn't have any knowledge about the 5-member group's true origins. From that perspective, the swarm should only know that the 5-member group belonged to the Descendants faction. And, given Buller's earlier education session, the arrogance and haughtiness of these Descendants would seem entirely expected. Based on surface-level information, the swarm might also deduce that the 5-member group held extraordinary status. Thus, Troy's shift in attitude under their pressure would appear reasonable. Moreover, their apparent concept of time, where 20 years of negotiations felt like nothing, gave the swarm the impression that their efficiency was abysmal. So, the protracted negotiations weren't surprising at all. In fact, if not for the Reincarnated System campaign, these talks might have dragged on indefinitely. With this in mind, the strategist's goal became obvious. But this realization made Luo Wen doubt his conclusions. He went back to the start, retraced his reasoning, and still arrived at the same conclusion: the other side was buying time for the swarm. Indeed, reality was even more bizarre than imagined. Could the swarm have an invisible ally? Was Luo Wen some heir to a mighty civilization, with countless factions secretly paving the way for him? If Luo Wen didn't know for a fact that he was an entirely foreign species, he might have started believing it himself. Since it wasn't some grooming a successor scheme, what was the opposing side's goal? The strategist clearly understood the swarm to some extent, knowing that time was their most critical need. Their deliberate stalling was intended to grant the swarm room to grow. If this reasoning held, then Troy's 200,000 strong fleet pressing at their borders was merely a form of pressure, urging the swarm to develop at maximum speed. In other words, granting the swarm extra time wasn't an easy task for the strategist. They needed to limit the time granted as much as possible. That implied the existence of an even more powerful force above the strategist. Luo Wen raised an eyebrow. That made sense. If they were already the strongest, they wouldn't need to act so covertly. The Daki civilization's attempt at revenge was likely part of the strategist's plan, as well, a form of evaluation or test. To gauge the swarm's progress? But the swarm's military strength was already on full display. There was no need for war, a few observations could provide a rough estimate. Odd. Luo Wen fell into deep thought again. Wait. Luo Wen suddenly realized he had fallen into an intelligence trap. What he assumed to be common knowledge was, in fact, unknown to many. While he knew that the primordial bodies were the real deal, the shadowy strategist did not. Did the strategist think the swarm might resort to producing substandard units under pressure, creating defective filler troops to bluff their way into an imposing display? Perhaps this was why they sent a subordinate to inspect the goods. Of course, pawns like the Daki civilization were likely unaware of the deeper schemes at play. As for the Troy civilization, though they were also pawns, these 300-pound muscular brutes seemed to be more clever than they initially appeared. The Recon system campaign had clearly left the hidden strategist impressed, perhaps overly so, with the swarm's rapid development. This was evident from the sudden shift in the negotiation pace at Origin A11. The abrupt change from stalling for time to rushing to conclude the talks was anything but subtle. The transition was jarring, riddled with flaws, forcing Luo Wen to rethink everything and connect the dots to draw new conclusions. It seemed the strategist's plan had entered its next phase. But what was their ultimate goal? Luo Wen quickly formed a preliminary hypothesis: the strategist needed the swarm to reach a certain level of strength, but not to exceed their control. What did they intend to do with such a swarm? Luo Wen had no answer. The information available was too limited to support further analysis. Fortunately, as the strategist continued moving pieces on the board, more information would inevitably be revealed. Armed with the conclusions he had drawn so far, Luo Wen felt he had gained a small measure of initiative. When the time came, he would counter their moves as needed. But before that, the swarm needed to accelerate its development. With absolute strength, all conspiracies and schemes would be rendered meaningless. When the time came, Luo Wen would smash the chessboard, drag the strategist into the open, and make them understand the true meaning of power. Currently, the swarm had already made significant advancements in various technologies, many of which were already operational. Thanks to their fungal carpet-based templates, the swarm's combat units were highly modular and organized. Upgrading and retrofitting existing forces would undoubtedly give those plotting against them a pleasant surprise. After the arrival of the new G team, the negotiations at Origin A11 progressed swiftly. Within a year, despite some remaining details to iron out, the swarm officially joined the Interstellar Technological Confederation, becoming one of its members. In the following year, the swarm extended an invitation to the Recon civilization. The scientific personnel from both sides had already been carefully selected, totaling more than 100,000 individuals, 3,000 from the swarm and the remainder from the Recon civilization. Given the Recon civilization's larger population, it was impossible to construct an ecosystem-compatible colony for them within swarm territory. Thus, the assembly point was established at the Twin Star colony in the Recon system. All personnel would gather there and wait for a G-ship to transport them. The preparations were intricate and demanding. Luo Wen had long arranged specialized swarm bodies for the 3,000 swarm researchers. However, after careful consideration, he decided against making these bodies too conspicuous. This batch of swarm bodies would lack the ability to survive unprotected in space. Instead, their circulatory systems were redesigned based on samples of native organisms from the Genesis planet. Additionally, a new type of biological protective armor was developed to address the small anomalies Buller had previously noticed. As for the Recon civilization, the swarm naturally wouldn't miss the opportunity for infiltration. Their goals here were far less ambitious than with swarm intelligent entities. Although the swarm was sending only 3,000 researchers, they garnered far more attention than the 100,000 Recon personnel. Due to the swarm's relatively short time controlling the Recon civilization and their decision not to use aggressive conversion tactics, only 20% of the Recon researchers were disguised swarm intelligent entities. This cautious approach also accounted for the uncertainty about whether the Interstellar Confederation had methods to detect such abnormalities. The vastness of the interstellar expanse meant this journey was essentially a one-way trip. The departing personnel were given 10 years to bid farewell to their families and friends. These 10 years also happened to be the time required for the G to dispatch a ship to retrieve them. Chapter 403, Boarding the Ship. In the blink of an eye, 10 years had passed, and the G fleet arrived on schedule. It was said they departed from another G outpost, though the exact distance from there to the Recon system remained unclear. This was a small fleet with the distinctive style of treasure starships, consisting of 2 massive transport ships over 6,000 meters long and 23,000 meter class escort ships. The G ships had undergone significant advancements in miniaturization and precision engineering, incorporating space-bending technologies to achieve their current scale. Even among 3,000 meter class warships, the G's vessels far outclassed those of the Troy civilization, which couldn't even compare. The fleet docked at the spaceport of the Twin Star colony in the Recon system. Perhaps it was a trick of perception, but from afar, the imposing presence of the dozens of G warships seemed to overshadow the nearby 1,000-ship Recon fleet. Everything had been meticulously pre-planned. Since this was the Recon civilization's first formal appearance on the Confederation stage, their leadership had taken the matter seriously, assigning a specialized team to oversee the event. With rehearsals completed many times beforehand, the entire process unfolded without delays. Orderly and efficient, the personnel in charge directed the researchers to begin boarding the G transport ships. The transport ships, with their unprecedented 6,000 meter length, dwarfed the nearby 2,000 meter Recon fleet, making them appear even more massive. To Luo Wen, these were the largest vessels he had seen so far. Rumor had it that the G also possessed super transport ships exceeding 10,000 meters in length. However, to Luo Wen, these were mere curiosities. Compared to the swarm's megastructures, they were nothing but scraps. Apart from being faster, their size was truly unimpressive child's play compared to the swarm's titans. Of course, the speed difference was nothing to scoff at. Comparing these ships to the swarm's vessels was akin to comparing a snail to a rocket, a stark gap, so vast it defied analogy. While the G warships were tightly guarded, making it impossible for outsiders to learn much about their internal structures, the transport ships were a different story. Thanks to the perspective of the swarm's intelligent entities, Luo Wen was able to fully experience the G's boarding procedures firsthand. Because the researchers had already passed the G's tests beforehand, there was no need for another round of evaluations. After boarding the transport ships, they were guided by a combination of G personnel and machines to form orderly lines, leading into individual rooms. The rooms were spacious yet minimalistic, containing only essential detection equipment. Here, the researchers underwent a series of tests. The first step was a comprehensive check of physical functions. Researchers destined for G territory needed to be healthy, physically robust, and free of latent illnesses. Following this was full-body sterilization to ensure no bacteria or viruses were carried aboard. This step also doubled as a scan for any concealed weapons. In addition, body structure scans, external feature analyses, and genetic backups were all performed. Once these procedures were completed, each researcher was assigned a new identity along with a personal terminal. They were then directed to enter hibernation pods. After all, the journey from the Recon system to G territory was no short trip even at the G's advanced ship speeds, it would take considerable time. Naturally, this time was not meant to be idly spent. Luo Wen observed all of this. What lay ahead was crucial to the implementation of his long-term plans. For the first time in ages, he felt a twinge of nervousness and emotion he had almost forgotten he could experience. Thankfully, everything proceeded smoothly. No alarms sounded, no abnormalities were detected. The swarm's intelligent entities disguised as Recon researchers passed the inspections effortlessly. Apart from their minds, they were identical to their originals, and G technology clearly couldn't penetrate into the soul. Luo Wen exhaled in relief. If the disguised Recons passed so easily, then the swarm researchers would pose even less of an issue. They didn't even have originals to compare against, in a sense, they were the originals. Any peculiarities would simply be regarded as normal for them. Since the inspections required participants to wear only basic clothing, an environment suitable for such conditions had to be provided. Thus, the swarm researchers underwent their examinations separately from the Riken researchers. For the first time, they revealed their true forms to the world. As non-combatants, their armor, while still adorned with horns and spikes, was more decorative than practical and far less intimidating. Before the G inspection personnel, this layer of armor slowly retracted, compacting into a solid mass and condensing at their chests. "Wow, that's so cool," exclaimed one of the G inspectors, a 1.6 meter tall figure with blue fur covering their face, resembling a monkey. The origins of their species were unclear. "What is that?" another G member asked, eyes wide as they studied the exposed swarm researcher. This inspector had dark skin and stood over 2 meters tall. His muscular build was impressive but differed from the 300-pound Troy warriors. His musculature was more refined and proportional. However, next to the diminutive blue-furred monkey, he towered like a steel colossus. The swarm researcher, now without armor, appeared somewhat slender. They stood about 1.8 meters tall, with 2 eyes and a mouth, features common enough to seem unremarkable. "This is our biological parasitic armor, which also serves as our protective suit. Apologies, but it is symbiotically linked to my bloodstream. I can retract it temporarily, but I cannot remove it," the swarm researcher explained calmly. "Incredible. I have to document this and report it immediately," declared the towering muscle man, who promptly began operating his recording device. "Wow, this is way better than our armor. It's hard to believe something this advanced could come from a place as remote as this," the blue-furred G inspector exclaimed, continuing his string of amazement. The room was designed to be suitable for the swarm but not for the monkey-like G inspector's species. To cope, he wore a simplified protective suit that shielded him from the room's gravity and a face mask to filter out harmful gases. These suits were standard equipment for the G, a necessity given their diverse composition as a race of immigrants. The G civilization was a melting pot of species, each with unique physiological needs and ecological preferences. For one race, breathable air might be a deadly poison to another. This diversity drove the rapid evolution of the G's protective suit technology, which had reached its current level of sophistication. The standard G suits were designed for use on habitable planets with atmospheres. They could adjust or counteract gravity within certain limits, and their face masks automatically filtered atmospheric elements harmful to the wearer's species. Although G suits were already lightweight and aesthetically pleasing, they still required some effort to wear. In comparison, the swarm's biological armor, which could be donned and retracted at will and even provided some exoskeletal support, was vastly superior. Chapter 404, Inspection. Have you ever considered offering this technology to the G race? I'm sure it would fetch a great price. Oh, my mistake, since we're now all part of the G race, shouldn't you consider donating this technology to the collective instead? The hulking muscle-bound figure raised his head as he spoke. Although he appeared honest and simple, his words carried a cunning undertone, not only aiming to take advantage but also sow discord. To some extent, what he said was true. The swarm member shook his head. This parasitic armor is issued exclusively by the swarm, and its technology is strictly confidential. He gestured in a wide arc with his hand. None of us here, none of the swarm members in this place know the specifics of this technology. TCH. The muscle-bound figure clicked his tongue in annoyance. All right, that's beyond my clearance. I'll leave it to the higher UPS to handle. He muttered, his voice trailing off, though it was faintly audible. At least reporting this information itself can earn me some benefits, it's not a wasted trip. Unwilling to give up entirely, he added, we're all going to be on the same team from now on, so if you have any good stuff, consider bringing it out early to exchange for points. Without waiting for the swarm members to ask what points were for, he continued as though answering his own question, what's the use of points, you ask? They're great. With enough points, you can live a more comfortable life, gain access to more resources, apply for advanced laboratories, and even browse higher-level knowledge. In short, the more points, the better. Unfortunately, despite his lengthy sales pitch, none of the swarm members responded. He felt slightly embarrassed, though his dark skin conveniently hid any blush. It turned out these inspection personnel weren't just responsible for escorting foreign researchers, they also had the job of extracting valuable technologies, a program colloquially referred to as the Keep It in the Family initiative. For example, if a foreign researcher possessed a technology that the G-race did not have, and this technology could be exchanged for 5 points, the receiving personnel and the researcher would split half of the points. Then, the two would divide that half equally between them. This meant that when the researchers' civilization later attempted to exchange the same technology for points, it would show as already stored in the G database and thus ineligible for further exchange. This clever system not only restricted the acquisition of points by foreign researchers but also sowed discord between them and their original civilizations. It was a win-win for the G. However, as the number of foreign civilizations grew and most had already been influenced by G technological pathways, the pool of unique technologies to extract had dwindled. The Swarm, however, was one of the few civilizations in the Confederation that primarily pursued biotechnology. It undoubtedly possessed many unique technologies, making this assignment a coveted opportunity for individuals like the muscle-bound figure and the blue-haired monkey. Yet despite discovering something promising at the outset, they now felt as if they were leaving a treasure trove empty-handed, which deeply frustrated them. In addition to personnel inspections, all luggage and personal items brought aboard had to undergo rigorous checks in another room before being allowed on the ship. The G-race maintained a relatively humane policy for incoming members. Every researcher who passed the screening process was permitted to carry up to 50 kilograms of non-living items onto the ship. However, the inspections here were much stricter. Unlike personnel checks, which rarely resulted in incidents, luggage checks were notorious for mishaps. Who were these researchers? They were specialists in all sorts of fields, and the most common items they brought were electronic storage devices and printed books. Next came clothing and personal mementos, and finally, their favorite experimental materials. These materials were wildly diverse. Radioactive items were considered normal, unstable explosive substances were not uncommon, and some even brought bacteria or toxins. While the pre-boarding guidelines explicitly prohibited such items, violations were still rampant. After all, what malicious intent could these researchers possibly have? They simply wanted to bring some experimental materials aboard. "What's this?" a G inspection officer asked his colleague. In his hand was a pendant discovered in the luggage of a Recon researcher. The pendant appeared ordinary, resembling amber formed from some kind of plant secretion and strung on a simple woven cord. The pendant was particularly striking because it contained a small golden insect encased in pale blue transparent amber. The insect, no larger than a fingernail, was impeccably preserved. Its limbs and even its delicate antennae remained intact, gleaming brilliantly in gold. "It looks like some sort of bug, but I've never seen this specific kind before. Perhaps it's a local specialty from their home planet." The colleague glanced at it briefly and lost interest. "Hey, don't dismiss it so casually, it could be dangerous," the inspection officer exclaimed with exaggerated alarm. While his reaction seemed theatrical, it wasn't without reason. There was a precedent in G history involving a foreigner boarding with a specimen of a native life form. In that historical incident, the G inspectors had noticed the specimen but had regarded it as a harmless memento. After the ship launched, however, over 20 G members began dying mysteriously, with no discernible cause. Panic spread throughout the vessel, and it wasn't until the death toll surpassed 100 that the true culprit was discovered. The specimen emitted a faint neurotoxin that wasn't catalogued in the G's database and thus had gone undetected during the initial inspection. This toxin, harmless to the native people and even mildly invigorating for them, acted as a slow poison for many other species. It caused progressive respiratory distress, eventually leading to suffocation. Following that disaster, G personnel tasked with escorting foreigners became particularly vigilant about unusual biological specimens in luggage. While such items were not outright banned, they were subject to stringent scrutiny. "All right, let's figure out what this little thing actually is," the colleague said, pulling out a scanning device. He waved it over the amber several times, allowing the data to upload to their computer for analysis. The results came back quickly. According to the information, this insect is a common species native to the Zonga forest near the equator of the Riken home world. It's called, well, the name's in their native language, and I can't pronounce it. The locals often encase these bugs in resin from blue pine trees to create pendants, which they believe bring good luck. Noticing that his colleague was about to continue with a lengthy explanation, the inspection officer quickly interrupted. Stop. You know what I care about. Don't waste time." "Fine," the colleague relented, summarizing, "the notes from the information department indicate that it's a safe species and can be carried on board." Hearing this, the inspection officer shrugged, tossed the pendant back into the luggage, and marked it as cleared for transport. Chapter 405, Doubts. The inspection process for over 100,000 researchers and their belongings was incredibly time-consuming. With the G-race's limited staff and constrained facilities, the entire process took nearly a year to complete. Fortunately, none of the boarding personnel were found to have any abnormalities. All were in good health, and no strange pathogens were detected. As for the luggage, while a few hazardous items were discovered, further investigation revealed no intentional wrongdoing by the owners, so these were deemed minor issues. Once cleared, the researchers began entering their cryosleep pods, while their luggage was stored separately. With all preparations complete, 2G transport ships, escorted by 18 warships, slowly departed the starport and began accelerating. The light from the ship's engines gradually dimmed, eventually disappearing into the vast sea of stars. The G-Race's warp drive technology was highly advanced. Their warp bubbles were incredibly stable and compact, eliminating the need to avoid large gravitational sources like planets. Unlike Troy warships, which had to exit their star systems before activating warp, the G-Fleet initiated their warp drives just 5 million kilometers beyond the twin star defensive zone under the watchful gaze of the swarm's observer bugs. Moments later, their forms blurred, and optical radar could no longer track their precise coordinates. However, warp bubbles, being a special kind of gravitational field, could still be detected using gravitational wave radars. Hundreds of intelligent entities were on high alert, constantly tracking the ship's coordinates and calculating their speed, twice the speed of light, 3 times, 4 times. The ships accelerated rapidly, stabilizing at 8 times the speed of light and maintaining that velocity. Luo Wen's expression grew serious. The G-Race's technological sophistication exceeded even his most pessimistic expectations. Back when the Troy diplomats had been negotiating, there was speculation about the origin of the 5-member G delegation in an attempt to estimate their ship's speed. The resulting calculations were terrifying. Learning that they had traveled aboard Troy warships to the negotiation site had brought some relief at the time. But now, reality proved even worse than Luo Wen had feared. 8 times the speed of light, this with large transport ships in tow. The G warships were likely even faster. And this might not even represent their cutting-edge technology. After all, this was merely a fleet for transporting foreign researchers, a peripheral operation. Their main battle fleets could be far more formidable. Suddenly, Luo Wen's brow furrowed. Something felt off. While the situation was dire, it might not be as catastrophic as it seemed. If the swarm were just an ordinary foreign civilization, his earlier concerns would have been valid. However, the swarm was now an essential piece on the interstellar chessboard. Given the prolonged delays during the negotiations, it was clear the mastermind behind the scenes needed the swarm to fit a specific mold. To achieve this, they would undoubtedly employ various methods to reshape and influence the current state of the swarm. Yet, due to time constraints, the swarm lacked significant allies or enemies and had no critical stakes in the larger interstellar network. As things stood, there were limited means by which the mastermind could exert influence over the swarm. This made the G-Race's current mission a rare point of contact for the swarm with the outside world highly significant. If the swarm failed to meet the mastermind's expectations during this encounter, they would not let such an opportunity go to waste. Considering how smoothly the G-ships had left without any conflict with the swarm, it was highly likely that their actions during departure were a subtle display of military strength. This display, conducted at maximum capacity, suggested that 8 times the speed of light might be the current technological limit of the G-race. But what exactly were they trying to accomplish? Was this military pressure intended to heighten the swarm's sense of crisis? Were they trying to accelerate the swarm's growth under external threats? The swarm's rapid mass production capabilities had already been acknowledged, so were they now pushing the swarm to improve not just in quantity but also in quality? This situation? It felt suspiciously like a contrived plot, where a divine mandate was being thrust upon the swarm. The mastermind seemed to have set up a hypothetical enemy for the swarm to stimulate its development almost as if they were racing against time. Could it be that the mastermind pulling the strings was actually a hidden rebel organization within the Interstellar Technological Confederation? If they were opposing the G-race, they would need a powerful ally. The swarm, with its potential, its lack of desire for life-bearing planets, and its relatively non-violent tendencies judging from how it treated the Riken and Ratfolk, appeared to be a trustworthy candidate for such an alliance. Most importantly, the swarm's rapid unit production made it an excellent source of cannon fodder. Perhaps, once the swarm reached a certain level of development, an organization might suddenly reveal itself, claiming they had secretly cultivated the swarm all along and now needed it to spearhead the charge against the evil G-race? Luo Wen raised an eyebrow. This was amusing speculation, but speculation nonetheless. What if the opposing faction had deliberately set up this scenario, allowing Luo Wen to arrive at this conclusion, just to achieve their actual goals? Was this the legendary case of "I predicted your prediction of my prediction"? The kind of convoluted strategy where they seemed to be on the fifth layer of complexity but were actually operating on an entirely different plane? This was becoming increasingly difficult to unravel real and fake, truth and deception. Who could tell which layer they were operating on? The only viable strategy was to respond to each move as it came. However, there was one fundamental question: how could they be certain that the swarm would be able to observe the G-ships at all? This was the premise of everything. If they couldn't guarantee that the swarm could detect them, then wasn't all this theater for nothing? An act performed for blind spectators? The swarm's technological level had always been carefully concealed. Based on its outwardly displayed capabilities, it shouldn't have been able to detect the G-fleet within its warp bubble. Even if the swarm suspected something, they would lack evidence. And truly, without some external help, it would have been impossible for the swarm to achieve in mere centuries what had taken other civilizations tens of thousands of years. Even with millions of intelligent entities working tirelessly without complaint, normal technological research would never have been able to produce such breakthroughs in such a short time, especially in an entirely different field like biotechnology. When Luo Wen had first captured Godzilla, it had taken him months to decode the creature's biological controlled fusion technology, resulting in the development of the atomic furnace. But there had also been a hidden genetic fragment, which took Luo Wen over a year to fully analyze. Godzilla was a truly legendary organism. Its evolutionary achievements were almost beyond comprehension. Even with Luo Wen's abilities, replicating Godzilla's state of evolution would take an unimaginable amount of time. Nevertheless, Godzilla had provided Luo Wen with tremendous benefits, instantly elevating the swarm's combat power by several tiers and solving numerous technological bottlenecks such as the endurance issues of the space octopuses. Its contributions extended not only to the past but also to the present, continuing to aid the swarm. Chapter 406, Speculation. Godzilla's body weighed an astonishing 100,000 tons. Such immense weight would be nearly impossible to support, even if its bones were made of superalloys. To manage this, it employed electromagnetic fields to support and restrain its body, preventing it from being crushed under its own weight. Even with this assistance, Godzilla's movement was extremely challenging. Thus, it utilized another unique ability, one that took Luo Wen over a year to fully decipher. This ability allowed Godzilla to swim rapidly in water and even move on land. When Luo Wen first encountered it, his limited understanding led him to believe it was merely a pseudo-anti-gravity technology based on magnetic fields, similar to the beetles on the Genesis planet. However, as Luo Wen's knowledge expanded and his horizons broadened, he realized it was something entirely different. Unlike the pseudo-anti-gravity technology, which worked by creating interactions between biological magnetic fields and planetary magnetic fields to cancel out portions of gravity, Godzilla's ability represented true anti-gravity or, more accurately, gravity manipulation. At the time, this technology was far too advanced for Luo Wen and the swarm. Without the foundational scientific theories to support it, they were unable to fully develop or apply it. Luo Wen, however, understood that using such a sophisticated technology merely to offset one's own weight was a colossal waste. Even though the swarm's intelligent entities at that time were far fewer than they are now, Luo Wen assigned a significant portion of them to study the technology. Despite their efforts, progress was slow and sporadic. The breakthrough came with the discovery of the Riken treasure starship. The ship's primary engine was a warp drive. Though it was a defective model, a false path designed to mislead emerging civilizations, it provided the swarm with invaluable insights. Before, the swarm had the result but no way to calculate how it had been achieved, like knowing the answer to a complex equation but having no idea how it was solved. The data from the ship provided a formula. Even though the data provided by Clio revealed that the result was incorrect, the formula itself was over 70% accurate. If the formula were more flawed, it would fail to mislead emerging civilizations, but at 70% accuracy, it could still effectively confuse them. With a partially correct formula and a correct result as a reference, the swarm quickly identified the errors and derived a true, accurate formula. Thus, unbeknownst to the rest of the galaxy, the swarm had already mastered warp technology. Luo Wen, however, chose to keep this achievement hidden from the outside world. The adversaries at the time were too weak, and Luo Wen's constant mental sparring with the Watchers encouraged him to play it cautiously, keeping his cards close to his chest. Mastering warp technology naturally included the ability to detect it. But since the swarm had never demonstrated this capability externally, other factions might suspect but could not confirm it. Was this recent display by the G an attempt to verify whether the swarm had warp detection capabilities? Information gleaned from the Daki civilization hinted that some factions speculated the swarm originated from an unknown star region and had somehow ended up here. After all, the civilizations in this region predominantly followed mechanical development paths. A fast-growing biological civilization like the swarm emerging out of nowhere was indeed suspicious. It was logical to hypothesize that the swarm might possess some advanced technologies. But how could they confirm this? Even if the swarm detected their movements, they wouldn't willingly reveal it. Were the G expecting the swarm to announce their capabilities? That was impossible. Alternatively, could G technology have methods to extract this information? The swarm's gravitational radar currently operated passively, collecting data rather than emitting signals. Although this method had some latency, it was sufficient during peacetime and avoided active detection risks. Unless the G had technology capable of prying into passive systems, the swarm's true capabilities remained hidden. This led Luo Wen to another question: was this maneuver simply a calculated gamble, or did they have a specific plan to expose the swarm's hidden cards? Luo Wen considered that with observer bugs scattered throughout swarm territory and the swarm network enhancing their capabilities, latency in their monitoring systems was negligible. Since the swarm's observation methods were passive, the G-race would have no way of knowing they were being monitored. Could it be that Buller had reported the possibility that the swarm had detected G-monitoring devices? Did the Troy civilization then escalate this report, eventually catching the attention of the G-race? This was plausible. However, observing G-monitoring devices and tracking warp bubbles, while both categorized under gravitational radar, were entirely different technologies. The gap between them was several orders of magnitude. This information alone would not be enough for the G to conclude that the swarm had mastered warp technology. The logic of this theory was tenuous. Although there was a chance it might be true, there were inconsistencies. If the G's new policies benefited anyone, it would be the descendants faction of the new G race, whose mindset had already shifted. But this contradicted their earlier strategy of stalling negotiations. Why would they deliberately cultivate a potential enemy? It seemed like an illogical move unless they were irrationally reckless. Luo Wen felt lost in the fog of speculation. Cutting off this train of thought, he decided to return to the basics. Demonstrating military strength, creating pressure, instilling a sense of crisis in the swarm, prompting qualitative improvements, and setting the stage for some grand destiny. All of these required one fundamental condition: the swarm had to be made aware of this military strength. This implied that the G likely had follow-up actions planned. But then Luo Wen reconsidered: the swarm had no overt conflicts with the G race, nor had there been any major disputes. The swarm had just joined the Interstellar Technological Confederation and had even submitted researchers as required. Although fewer researchers were sent than expected, this shouldn't be enough to provoke hostility from the G. If that's the case, could the G's supposed interest in the swarm be an illusion they intentionally created? No, that didn't entirely add up. While some of the information came from the Troy civilization, similar intelligence had also been obtained from the Daki civilization, and the intelligent entities responsible for analyzing it would not deceive Luo Wen. Luo Wen delved deeper into his thoughts. Perhaps the mastermind behind all this included elements from within the G race itself, specifically, a smaller faction within it. After all, from the perspective of the Daki civilization, the G race was a monolithic entity, they wouldn't know about its internal divisions. If this was the case, could it be the G opposition faction treating the swarm as a pawn? It would make sense they were likely suppressed within the G race and sought to cultivate a force capable of directly opposing their own people. Such a force couldn't outright surpass the G race, though, otherwise, even if the opposition gained power, they would still lose their relevance. This hypothesis aligned more closely with the available evidence. However, Luo Wen would need to analyze their future actions to confirm it. Nonetheless, his thinking had become clearer, and the fog seemed to be lifting. After the G ships departed with the researchers, 2 warships from their original escort remained behind. Their mission was to install quantum communication devices for the swarm and the Riken and to provide training for maintenance and operation personnel. In addition, these ships were tasked with overseeing the construction of the Trade City. Chapter 407, Trade City. According to the regulations of the Interstellar Technological Confederation, new member civilizations are required to open a city to serve as a hub for tourism, exchanges, and fostering mutual understanding. This city must also be equipped with quantum communication devices to facilitate real-time communication with other Confederation members. After all, when foreign visitors arrive, differences in values and customs are inevitable, potentially leading to incidents of misconduct. Resolving such issues whether through local laws or repatriation to their home civilization requires extensive and instantaneous communication. Although referred to as a city, it is often effectively equivalent to opening an entire planet. For the purposes of inter-civilization trade, a single city is simply too small. The trade city must be located on an ecological planet so that visiting aliens only need basic protective gear, such as light suits and filtration masks, to operate comfortably. Most emerging civilizations possess territories limited to a single star system. Unless they are extraordinarily fortunate, their home system generally contains only one ecological planet, their home world. Opening a trade city therefore often means granting access to a portion of their home world, which is typically the nucleus of their civilization, housing their ruling class, research institutions, and cutting-edge laboratories. This openness poses significant security risks, as it exposes these critical assets and individuals to potential harm. In the past, nascent civilizations were allowed to designate trade cities on non-ecological colony planets. However, a catastrophic incident changed this practice. Due to the lack of atmospheric protection, spacecraft could bypass orbital defenses and directly impact the planetary surface. On one occasion, an unidentified vessel disguised as a foreign tourism ship managed to fool the identification systems of a trade city on a non-ecological colony. The ship then accelerated to a staggering speed and rammed into the city. This trade city, located on an airless and radiation-exposed colony, lacked adequate external protection. The colliding vessel not only carried immense kinetic energy but was also loaded with massive amounts of explosives. The impact and subsequent explosion severely damaged the trade city. Although emergency systems were in place, they were overwhelmed by the scale of the attack. As a result, the city's atmosphere, under intense pressure, was violently vented into space, dragging countless individuals and objects into the vacuum. While property losses were negligible, the unprepared individuals, lacking spacesuits, stood no chance of survival against the combined forces of extreme cold, oxygen deprivation, and cosmic radiation. To this day, the perpetrating vessel's origins, motivations, and purpose remain unknown. However, following this tragedy, the rules were amended. Trade cities of emerging civilizations must be located on ecological planets. This ensures that all incoming vessels must dock at orbital starports before smaller shuttles ferry visitors to the surface. Moreover, on an ecological planet, as long as filtration masks remain intact, the risk of natural fatalities is minimal. The history of this policy, while harsh and unfriendly to emerging civilizations, leaves little room for negotiation. Without the power to resist, compliance becomes the only option. For the Riken, the choice was straightforward. They had no option but to open a portion of their home world. In contrast, the Swarm, with its territorial range vastly exceeding that of typical nascent civilizations, had far more flexibility. After careful deliberation, Luo Wen decided to locate the Swarm's trade city in the Sandstorm system. To its 12 to 1 o'clock position lies the Riken system. To its 2 o'clock position is the neighboring star system. To its 4 o'clock position is the Genesis system. Between 5 and 6 o'clock is the Golden Horn system. To its 10 o'clock position, one star system away, lies the territory of the Daki civilization. From 7 to 9 o'clock, it borders other Confederation members at a distance of one star system. Overall, the Sandstorm system represents the Swarm's outermost territory, situated closest to the Interstellar Technological Confederation. This location complies with Confederation rules while also maximizing the protection of the Swarm's privacy. The Sandstorm system, apart from its star, consists of 9 major planets. The third planet lies in the habitable zone and is slightly larger than the Genesis planet. However, its biological evolution is still at the unicellular stage, making it a very primitive world. Luo Wen named this planet Storm God Planet, in honor of the aerial dominators that had greatly contributed to the Swarm's development. The Storm God combat units had not been phased out despite advancements in other areas. Due to the low density of space octopuses, their primary battlefield remained outer space. On the other hand, the repeatedly upgraded Storm God proved more effective in atmospheric environments and was significantly cheaper to produce. As a result, the Storm God remained an active part of the Swarm's combat lineup. Since the Swarm had little need for ecological planets and the primitive state of life on Storm God Planet offered no valuable biological insights, the planet had seen minimal development. Furthermore, the Swarm had no real experience constructing cities. However, this posed no issue for Luo Wen. Just dig a few interconnected burrows, and voila, you have a city. Luo Wen thought. The swarm's outward image had always been somewhat primitive, so their city should reflect that aesthetic as well. As for concerns about the city being crude, lacking high-tech amenities, providing a poor experience, and failing to attract merchants or tourists, Luo Wen couldn't care less. The swarm wasn't particularly interested in trade, and fewer visitors would be preferable. Meanwhile, due to the proximity of the twin-star defensive zone to the Reikan homeworld, the 2G warships first traveled to the Reikan homeworld. The Reikans designated a plot of land far from their capital and constructed a new city in accordance with Confederation requirements. The Interstellar Technological Confederation currently boasts over 200 member factions, encompassing an incredible diversity of species. Some, such as the giant race, stand over 10 meters tall. As a result, the Reikan's original architectural standards fell short of accommodating the needs of all potential visitors. While it was unlikely the giants would visit within thousands or even tens of thousands of years, necessary facilities had to be prepared to avoid potential diplomatic disputes or accusations of racial discrimination. Fortunately, while the Reikan were considered newcomers to the Confederation, their technological level made constructing a city relatively straightforward. For a spacefaring civilization capable of interstellar colonization, rapidly building a city was standard practice. Over a century ago, when the Reikan invaded the neighboring star system, they established numerous outposts and bases in a short span. Building a city on their home turf was an even simpler task. Massive alloy modules were deployed directly from orbit. On the ground, construction machinery was already in position, tasked with leveling the terrain and assembling the components. Within 6 months, the city had taken shape. The process was only slightly delayed by changes in module specifications and the construction team's unfamiliarity with the revised parameters. During this period, the 2G warships remained stationed in orbit around the Reikan homeworld, supervising the construction. Chapter 408, Acting Skills. Luo Wen paid close attention to the G personnel stationed in the Reikan system. Given his lack of intelligence on them, even the smallest pieces of information could prove invaluable. After all, the Reikan system was officially considered a semi-swarm territory. Behind the scenes, the swarm controlled roughly 80% of it, making it effectively their home turf. As such, at least 1,000 observer bugs were covertly monitoring the 2G vessels in space, and there were countless informants on the Reikan's home world. Even the Reikan intelligence system itself was shared with the swarm. Under these circumstances, unless the G's technological capabilities surpassed the swarm's understanding, it would be impossible for them to escape the swarm's watchful eyes. Initially, Luo Wen suspected the G personnel were there to perform espionage in addition to supervising the construction projects. However, they showed no suspicious activity. Perhaps the Reikan themselves were too weak and transparent, with no secrets worth coveting. This might explain why the 2G ships stayed put, their crews spending all day holed up on their vessels. Maybe, when they eventually installed quantum communication devices for the swarm, they'd reveal some clues, but that would take time. Fortunately, Luo Wen had other matters to occupy his attention. Most of his focus was on the departing G transport fleet. With his earlier suspicions, Luo Wen had a feeling they were planning some sort of underhanded maneuver. And sure enough, his instincts were correct. After leaving the Reikan system, the G transport fleet didn't take the direct route toward the 9 o'clock direction, which was the fastest way to enter Confederation space. Instead, they initially headed toward the Sandstorm system in the 6:30 direction. To make their journey appear natural, they even flew far enough in that direction to leave the swarm's observation range. However, a minor flaw in their performance betrayed them. They slowed down briefly in the asteroid belt on the outskirts of the Sandstorm system, as if deliberately trying to ensure the swarm noticed them. Their acting is so clumsy, Luo Wen muttered. The G transport fleet's bizarre behavior reminded him of a match-fixing video he had seen before, with striking similarities. To be fair, Luo Wen understood the transport fleet commander's dilemma. In their understanding, the swarm wasn't supposed to detect warp bubbles. Trying to get noticed by the swarm under normal circumstances was indeed challenging, like expecting a blind person to spot a bird flying overhead. The G's actions, however, were akin to having the bird land next to the blind person, squawk loudly, and even flap its wings in their face just to make sure they got the message. It was overly deliberate, and Luo Wen couldn't help but feel speechless as he watched. When the G ships first arrived, Luo Wen had already noted their distinctive treasure starship aesthetic and massive size. But what had stood out most were the huge identification numbers painted directly on their hulls, hundreds of meters tall and impossible to miss. In addition, each ship was covered in graffiti, making them all uniquely identifiable. At the time, the G personnel explained that the new G race was a highly inclusive society, composed of over 200 different species. To showcase this inclusivity, they allowed crew members to decorate their ships to reflect their individuality. This explanation had initially left Luo Wen dumbfounded, but now he understood. This wasn't about individuality, it was to ensure the swarm didn't mistake them for another G fleet passing by. Although the performance was somewhat clumsy, it ultimately achieved its goal. Even if the swarm couldn't directly observe the warp bubble, they could easily calculate the G fleet's actual speed by comparing the departure time, the time they reached the sandstorm system, and the distance between the 2 points. This confirmed some of Luo Wen's earlier suspicions. The hidden mastermind was indeed trying to exert pressure on the swarm. They really see the swarm as nothing more than a pawn, Luo Wen chuckled, feeling the pressure lift significantly. The swarm clearly had a value in the mastermind's eyes that Luo Wen himself didn't fully understand. But as the saying goes, a blessing in disguise. From another perspective, this wasn't entirely a bad thing. At present, while the swarm was merely a pawn, it was still an immature one that needed to develop into what the mastermind envisioned. This meant the swarm had a period of safe development ahead of it. Time was precisely what the swarm needed most right now, and the mastermind had no idea what the swarm's core strengths truly were. What Luo Wen needed to do now was to seize every moment, rapidly strengthen this pawn, and, when the time came, smash the mastermind's plans, breaking their grip and leaving them utterly incapacitated. The calculated 8 times the speed of light was astonishing. After the G transport fleet completed its brief stop in the sandstorm system, it resumed its journey, quickly vanishing from the observer bug's field of view. Not long after, the intelligent entities on board the transport ships also moved beyond the reach of the swarm network. Over the years, the swarm had deployed numerous node units toward the Interstellar Technological Confederation, acting as signal relays. As the swarm network grew, the signal range of these nodes expanded to nearly 2 light-years. Yet, compared to the thousands of star systems encompassed by the Confederation, this coverage was a mere drop in the ocean. If the swarm network's coverage didn't extend further, any intelligence gathered by the nodes would remain out of reach, effectively nullifying its usefulness. However, attempting to expand the network into G-controlled territory through traditional means was nearly impossible. The Confederation was not just composed of the technologically inferior factions in the outer ring. The long-established civilizations in the middle and inner circles, with histories spanning tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years, had fortified their territories to an extreme degree. They likely had detailed records of every asteroid and meteor within their borders, complete with names and designations. If a swarm node unit were to intrude recklessly, it would undoubtedly draw attention. If captured, it could expose the swarm's operations. Furthermore, the Confederation's domain spanned thousands of star systems and tens of thousands of light-years. Even under perfect conditions, with node units transmitting at the speed of light, it would take tens of thousands of years to achieve full coverage. By then, the swarm might well have ceased to exist. Fortunately, this issue had already been addressed. Since the latest upgrade to the swarm network, any node unit could, when provided with sufficient energy and Luo Wen's permission, mutate into another type of swarm bug. This significantly reduced the reliance on the primary body and the brood nest, breaking the development bottleneck. It was from this point onward that the swarm truly began its unrestricted expansion. However, as Luo Wen delved deeper into his understanding of himself and the swarm network, he uncovered new insights into the roles of the primary body and the brood nest. Chapter 409, Anchor Point. Since his emergence from the Ephi-ish egg, Luo Wen had always felt somewhat confused. He lacked the inheritance of the Ephi-ish species, and even if he had it, his situation was entirely different from that of his predecessors. This was a new universe with rules completely distinct from the wizard continent. He was a new life form, born through a series of coincidences. In essence, he and the Ephi-ish as understood by the wizard continent had become two entirely different species. Initially, Luo Wen operated purely on instinct, collecting genetic fragments, fusing them, and, after a certain sacrificial ritual, gaining the swarm network, which elevated his life form to a higher state. After billions of years of dormancy, Luo Wen awoke as a being that was half corporeal and half virtual. His corporeal form served as the foundation of his virtual self, and both were inseparable. Subsequently, Luo Wen began modifying genetic fragments, cultivating intelligent entities, and leveraging their power and intellect to upgrade the swarm network. At one point, he seemed to transcend the limits of physicality entirely, becoming a being of the network. But that was merely his prior understanding. With the swarm network's upgrades, new dimensions of existence unfolded before him. Or rather, they had always been there, he simply couldn't perceive them before. Luo Wen, lacking any inherited knowledge, had to rely on instinct to sense, comprehend, and explore. When Luo Wen was troubled by how to infiltrate the Confederation's territories with his network signals, a sudden realization struck him. He came to understand certain truths. Previously, Luo Wen regarded the swarm network as his ability. Although deeply interconnected, he thought of it as akin to a relationship between an owner and a possession. Later, he began to believe that he was the swarm network itself. Perhaps, before the sacrificial ritual, his body had been that fingernail-sized insect or even the lid-sized giant bug. But after the ritual, he saw the swarm network as his true essence. Now, however, Luo Wen felt even this interpretation was imprecise. The sacrificial ritual had made him into an indescribable existence, and the swarm network was merely one of its manifestations and extension comprehensible within his current framework. Put another way, the swarm network was Luo Wen, but it was not the entirety of him. Luo Wen himself seemed to have ascended to a higher dimensional existence. However, in any dimension, there existed the strong and the weak. Having just undergone his transformation and rebirth, Luo Wen was the weakest form of such a being. Weaker beings instinctively seek ways to grow stronger. The newly born and frail Luo Wen had, by instinct, latched onto the nearest thing that could empower him. At the time, Luo Wen existed as a being separate from this universe, with countless dimensions and chaotic currents between them. For such a weak existence as he was then, finding and re-entering this universe would have been nearly impossible. Fortunately, there existed in this universe a shedding of his former self, an object intrinsically tied to him. This object acted as an anchor point, fortifying his connection to this universe. Moreover, as Luo Wen was effectively a being ascended from this universe, carrying its essence, the universe itself offered no resistance to his return. Thus, by a stroke of fate, Luo Wen regained control over his swarm body in this universe. However, this process drained his already limited energy, plunging him into a long slumber. With his newfound understanding, or rather, a deeper comprehension of himself, Luo Wen's perspective on many past events changed significantly. For instance, Luo Wen previously believed that the swarm network's formidable capabilities stemmed from his billions of years of dormancy. In truth, while Luo Wen was indeed a fledgling entity in the higher dimension, just as a child can still express themselves through drawings, a being from a higher dimension can exert influence over lower dimensions to a certain extent. This innate advantage had nothing to do with his dormancy or any other factors, it was a fundamental trait of higher dimensional existence. As for why Luo Wen slept for so long, one reason was undoubtedly the substantial energy expenditure he had incurred, necessitating recovery through rest. However, a more significant reason lay in the different perception and understanding of time for higher dimensional beings. When Luo Wen's consciousness fell into slumber, it operated purely on instinct, which attuned him to a higher dimensional timeline. From that perspective, he might have felt as though only a brief moment had passed. Thus, he overslept. By the time he awoke, his understanding of time in the lower dimensions had realigned. At that point, Luo Wen's body and essence had already transformed into a higher dimensional being, but his awareness and cognition remained rooted in the lower dimensions. Regardless, the priority was to grow stronger. It is important to clarify that this universe was not inherently lower dimensional. It was, in fact, a complex amalgamation of multidimensional systems, even surpassing Luo Wen in certain ways. However, some elements within it belonged to the lower dimensions, such as the pre-ascension Luo Wen, as well as creatures like dinosaurs, pterosaurs, ratfolk, Riken, Daki, and the worlds they comprehended. For Luo Wen to grow stronger, he needed to anchor himself within this universe and extract resources beneficial to his development. This process was akin to feeding, but feeding for a higher dimensional being was far more complex than what lower dimensional creatures could comprehend. It involved unique, abstract mechanisms. Before feeding, however, Luo Wen needed to secure his food. Relying on a single anchor point was inherently risky. If he lost this anchor, the odds of relocating this universe amidst the chaotic currents of dimensions would be almost non-existent. Even if he stumbled upon another universe, his then weak state would render infiltration impossible. In response to these challenges, the swarm network was born. Luo Wen had once believed this system was a manifestation of his obsession with real-time interaction technologies. In truth, it was a reflection of his higher dimensional essence expressed in a form comprehensible within the lower dimensional world. While his obsession might have influenced its creation, it was far from the sole reason. The swarm network allowed for rapid expansion and the emergence of numerous node units. However, these node units were not true anchor points. Only Luo Wen's so-called primary body and brood nest served as genuine anchor units. The node units, in turn, acted as guardians for these anchors, enhancing their security. At the time, Luo Wen didn't fully understand this. His focus remained on increasing the swarm's numbers and territorial expanse, a drive born from his instinct to protect and strengthen himself. If Luo Wen had fully transitioned into a higher dimensional being, he might have chosen to continue his slumber. For beings of that level, time was meaningless. As long as he remained anchored to this universe, he could draw sustenance and grow stronger. Whether it took 1 billion or 10 billion years to achieve his goals would have been irrelevant. Chapter 410, Essence. The universe itself, though its internal worlds may cycle and reset, exists on a higher level of being where time is meaningless. Luo Wen needed only to accompany it, lazily sleeping, to grow stronger in his dreams. However, Luo Wen had not fully transitioned into a higher dimensional being. He could not ignore the passage of time, and his lack of understanding of his essence led him to perform a variety of operations. By chance, he stumbled upon a way to accelerate his growth, the creation of intelligent entities. Regardless of Luo Wen's initial intent, the emergence of these intelligent entities undeniably made him stronger not just in technological terms, but more importantly, in the development of the swarm network. Perhaps this was because Luo Wen's ascension had been achieved through a sacrifice of both life and spirit, granting him the ability to absorb spiritual energy to enhance his essence. This was far more efficient than passively drawing energy from the universe. Moreover, while absorbing spiritual energy, he could simultaneously extract the universe's energy. The process of forming an intelligent entity involved the swarm network consuming the entirety of a spiritual entity, creating a blank slate, and then copying its original memories into this new entity. It is important to note that this process required the spiritual entity to first be absorbed and digested by Luo Wen, which in turn strengthened his essence. As for what an intelligent entity truly was, it could be understood as a derivative of Luo Wen's higher dimensional essence. This relationship was difficult for lower dimensional beings to comprehend. They might interpret it as a clone, a split personality, or even as akin to precise control over one's own cells, but none of these explanations suffice to describe the unique connection. Whether or not this relationship could be understood, Luo Wen grew stronger, and the swarm network grew more robust as a result. Unfortunately, Luo Wen's understanding of this higher dimensional growth was limited. What he could perceive was merely an increase in the node units' signal range and their ability to create more anchor points. At the time, Luo Wen used various methods, putting his primary body into dormancy or simulating death to hatch additional primary bodies and brood nests. In reality, his relationship with these primary bodies and brood nests was that of tools. They could have been created with far less effort, but Luo Wen's limited understanding caused him to overcomplicate the process. For higher dimensional beings, their power is largely an expression of their will. Yet Luo Wen was still confined by his old way of thinking, believing that a being could have only one primary body. This mental limitation hindered his ability to create more anchor points. Luo Wen's subsequent elaborate operations were, in essence, a way to hypnotize himself into bypassing these mental blocks. However, no matter how he circumvented them, he could only create 5 primary bodies or brood nests at the time. This limitation stemmed from his capabilities at that point, which allowed for a maximum of 5 anchor units. As Luo Wen's true essence grew stronger and his mindset gradually shifted, he came to understand more, and his abilities expanded. Yet, his self-awareness remained flawed. The so-called upgrade of the swarm network occurred. Afterward, Luo Wen believed he had fully transformed into a networked being. However, this transformation was simply an inherent aspect of his nature, his essence. Every network has a carrier. In the networks Luo Wen previously understood, their carriers were storage devices and electrical signals. Networks were not intangible, their signals could be intercepted, and destroying their carriers could dismantle them. But since its inception, the swarm network had never been detected by outsiders, nor by any known instrument. What, then, was its carrier? What was its method of transmission? How did the node units achieve instantaneous communication with zero delay? Now Luo Wen understood, the swarm network was an expression of his higher dimensional essence. To beings in lower dimensions, without the means to observe higher dimensions, the swarm network could never be detected no matter how advanced their technology or how deeply they investigated. It was simply beyond their grasp. Instantaneous communication now became much easier to comprehend. Although the swarm nodes appeared to be scattered across the lower dimensional world, in Luo Wen's higher dimensional essence, they were inherently unified. Communication occurred through exchanges outside the constraints of dimensions, naturally eliminating any delay. The relationship between the universe and Luo Wen's essence transcended the traditional concepts of large and small as understood by lower dimensional beings. As long as an anchor point existed, Luo Wen could effortlessly connect 2 points in the lower dimensional world through his higher dimensional body, completely bypassing the concept of distance in the lower dimensions. With this realization, Luo Wen experienced a profound sense of self-awareness and epiphany that made him feel as if he had truly understood himself for the first time. This was not a material or power-based ascension but a spiritual elevation, a deeper understanding and mastery of his true essence. As a result, problems that had once seemed insurmountable such as extending the swarm network's coverage throughout the Confederation now appeared manageable. Luo Wen's current capabilities allowed him to create up to 10 anchor units. These no longer needed to be tied to physical swarm bodies or brood nests, nor did they require the elaborate and resource-intensive efforts of the past. He could now freely design their form as he desired, limited only by their quantity. With this newfound flexibility, Luo Wen crafted a small golden insect encased in amber, disguising it as a personal belonging for one of the departing Riken intelligent entities. This inconspicuous anchor point would enable Luo Wen to locate the universe and breach its dimensional barriers, allowing him to connect with nearby swarm nodes. As the intelligent entities and the amber-encased insect drifted farther away, Luo Wen made yet another discovery. Node units themselves could transmit coordinates, though their signals were too weak to pierce through the many layers of barriers. Furthermore, Luo Wen's essence had previously been too feeble to actively locate them. However, when tens of thousands of node units gathered in one place, the combined strength of their signals rivaled that of an anchor unit. In such cases, even without a nearby anchor unit, Luo Wen could pinpoint their location and establish a connection. This revelation suggested that the limitation on the number of anchor units might become irrelevant. While the current cap of 10 seemed generous and Luo Wen had so far only utilized 2, it was clear that as technology advanced and the swarm speed increased, the network's coverage would eventually face new challenges. If, for example, the swarm reached the G-race's current warp speed of 8 times the speed of light, exploring unknown star systems would become cumbersome if they had to repeatedly decelerate, exit warp bubbles, and deploy network nodes. This would not only be inefficient but also significantly hinder their expansion efforts. Now, however, the solution was simple. As long as the exploration fleets maintained a sufficient number of node units, Luo Wen would never lose contact with them. Solving this potential issue before it arose left Luo Wen in high spirits. Additionally, as his essence continued to strengthen, the distinction between node units and anchor units might eventually blur. When that day came, any node unit could function as an anchor unit, regardless of its signal strength. Luo Wen would be able to locate them through even the most impenetrable barriers.